Some mistakes you can walk away from. You burn the toast, you apologize, you take the wrong exit, you turn around. Then there are the mistakes that rewrite your entire life before you even realize you've made them. Cora just wanted her shift to end. She saw a man about to die in the middle of a crowded bar, and she made a split-second choice to stop it. She kissed a dead man walking. She just didn't know he was the one holding the scythe. The air inside the Albatross always smelled of gin, stale lemon peels, and bad decisions. It was a high-end purgatory disguised as a speakeasy. Men in tailored suits brought women in rented dresses here to negotiate terms of surrender, both business and personal. Cora knew the ecosystem. She had been pouring drinks behind the mahogany bar for 3 years, long enough to become part of the furniture. She knew when to look away, she knew when to pour heavy, and she knew what an impending murder looked like. It was 1:15 a.m. on a Thursday. The late-night lull had settled over the room. The jazz trio in the corner was playing something slow, the upright bass thumping a steady, exhausted rhythm. Cora was wiping down the copper rail, her feet aching in ways that painkillers no longer touched. She noticed him first because he was entirely still. He sat in the back booth, a prime piece of real estate shrouded in velvet shadows. He wore a dark, unstructured jacket, no tie. His collar was open, revealing a sliver of scarred skin at his throat. A half-empty glass of amber liquid sat on the table before him. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't looking at the door. He was just staring at the ice melting in his glass, looking utterly, fundamentally tired. Then the atmospheric pressure in the room shifted. 3 men walked through the brass-handled front doors. They didn't check their coats. They didn't wait for the hostess. They moved with a synchronized, heavy-footed intent that parted the remaining crowd like water around stones. Cora's rag paused on the copper rail. She looked at their eyes, dead, focused, entirely devoid of the loose, drunken energy of the rest of the patrons. The lead man, thick-necked and wearing a leather jacket that was too heavy for the season, kept his right hand buried deep in his pocket. Cora traced their line of sight. It drew a straight, invisible line to the man in the back booth. He still hadn't moved. He was completely unaware. Cora's heart gave a slow, painful thud against her ribs. She had seen violence before. She had seen bottles broken over heads, knives flashed in alleys. But this was different. This was professional. This was an execution, and it was about to happen on her freshly polished floor. "Look away!" her brain screamed. "Drop the rag, go to the back room, and count the lemons." But her legs didn't move toward the kitchen. They moved out from behind the bar. It was a stupid, visceral impulse. It was the exhaustion. It was the sudden, overwhelming sickness of watching people get chewed up and spat out by a city that didn't care. She didn't want to see a man bleed to death over his scotch. She didn't want the police tape, the interrogations, the copper smell of blood ruining the air. The 3 men were closing the distance. 20 feet. 15. The lead man's shoulder dipped as he prepared to draw whatever heavy iron he had in that coat. The man in the booth finally looked up. His eyes were dark, unreadable, entirely devoid of panic. He looked at the men, and then, for a fraction of a second, his gaze flicked to Cora, who was speed-walking across the floor, 10 feet. The lead thug pulled his hand out of his pocket. A glint of blue steel caught the low light of the chandelier. Cora didn't think. If she thought, she would have frozen. Instead, she threw her body into the narrow space between the table and the leather jacket. She slammed her hands onto the dark fabric of the seated man's coat, leaned down, and crushed her mouth against his. It wasn't a romantic kiss. It was a collision. Her teeth clacked against his. She tasted peat smoke, expensive liquor, and a sharp, metallic tang of surprise. His lips were rigid for a microsecond. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the deafening crack of a gunshot, waiting for the burning tear of a bullet passing through her back to get to him. She dug her fingers into his lapels, pulling him up, trying to physically haul him out of the line of fire, turning her own body to create a flesh shield. Then something terrifying happened. He didn't pull away. He didn't scramble for cover. Instead, a large, impossibly warm hand gripped the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in her hair, calloused and firm. The other hand slid around her waist, and with a smooth, terrifying strength, he stood up, effortlessly reversing their positions. He spun her into the shadows of the booth, placing himself between her and the room. The kiss changed. It ceased to be her desperate, clumsy distraction and became a sudden, consuming claim. His mouth softened, moving against hers with a deliberate, slow rhythm that sent a violent shiver down her spine. The scent of him, cedar, ozone, and cold violence, enveloped her. For 3 seconds, the bar, the thugs, and the impending gunfire ceased to exist. There was only the heavy, suffocating weight of him pressing her against the velvet upholstery. Then he broke the kiss. He didn't look at her. He kept his body angled to shield hers, his face turned toward the open floor. Cora opened her eyes, gasping for air, her pulse roaring in her ears like a freight train. She looked over his shoulder. The 3 men had stopped dead in their tracks. The lead thug stood there, his gun halfway out of his pocket, his face a mask of utter confusion. The script had been broken. You don't shoot a man while he's making out with a waitress in public. It draws the wrong kind of attention. It makes it messy. "Excuse me," the man in front of Cora said. His voice was low, rough, and entirely calm. It sounded like gravel being crushed under a heavy tire. "You're interrupting." The silence in that corner of the bar was so absolute it felt heavy. The jazz music playing 50 feet away seemed to belong to a different planet. Cora stood frozen against the velvet booth, her chest heaving, the ghost of his mouth still burning on hers. The lead thug recovered first. His confusion morphed into a sneer. He took a half step forward, his hand tightening on the grip of the gun hidden in his coat. "Step aside, sweetheart. The guy you're swapping spit with has an expired ticket." Cora tried to speak, tried to say something, anything to de-escalate, but her throat was locked tight. The man shielding her didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his voice. He just let out a soft, almost amused sigh. "Leo," he said. He didn't yell the name. He just spoke it into the ambient noise of the room. Before the thug could pass the word, the shadows of the bar seemed to detach themselves from the walls. The bartender who had been wiping down the far end of the counter dropped his rag, his hand reappearing with a suppressed pistol leveled directly at the lead thug's head. 2 patrons who had been quietly drinking at a high-top table stood up, their suit jackets falling open to reveal shoulder holsters. A massive man stepped out from the hallway leading to the restrooms, blocking the exit. In the span of 4 seconds, the 3 assassins went from being the apex predators in the room to being entirely surrounded by a heavily armed firing squad. Cora watched the blood drain from the lead thug's face. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a sudden, stark terror. He realized what Cora was just beginning to understand. This wasn't an ambush. It was a trap. And she had just thrown herself right into the middle of the jaws. "Put it back in your pocket," the man standing in front of Cora said to the thug. His tone was conversational, bordering on bored. "Slowly, unless you want your brains decorating the ceiling tiles. They're vintage tin. It would be a shame to ruin them. The thug swallowed hard, the muscles in his thick neck working frantically. He slowly pushed the gun back down into the depths of his coat and raised his hands, palms out. His two companions did the same, their eyes darting around the room, counting the guns pointed at them. "Take them to the warehouse," the man said, dismissing them with a flick of his wrist. "Find out who paid them to be this stupid, then lose them." The men in the suits closed in. There was no shouting, no struggle. The three thugs were expertly corralled and ushered out the back door so smoothly that the couple making out in the next booth over didn't even notice. The jazz trio kept playing. The ambient hum of the bar resumed. Cora stood paralyzed. The adrenaline that had propelled her forward was rapidly burning off, leaving a cold, trembling void in its wake. She had kissed him to save his life. She had risked her own neck for a man who had absolute, terrifying control of the entire room. He finally turned around to face her. He was taller than she had realized when he was sitting down, broad-shouldered, carrying a quiet, dangerous weight. His eyes, now entirely focused on her, were the color of slate under a winter sky. They didn't hold gratitude. They held a clinical, dissecting curiosity. "Well," he said softly, looking down at her. "That was dramatic." Cora's mouth opened and closed. She swallowed the dry lump in her throat. "I thought they were going to shoot you." "They were," he replied, casually adjusting the cuffs of his unstructured jacket. "Or they were going to try. My men were waiting for them to draw first. Self-defense is easier to explain to the local precincts." You used yourself as bait." The realization made her stomach churn. "It's an efficient way to catch rats." He tilted his head, studying her face. "What I don't understand is you, a waitress with a death wish. You saw three men walking over with intent to kill, and your first instinct was to insert yourself into the line of fire." "I was trying to cause a scene," Cora shot back, a defensive anger finally sparking to life over her fear. "I was trying to save your life. You're welcome, by the way." A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You threw off my timing. You could have gotten us both killed." "I'll remember that the next time I see a guy about to get his head blown off," she snapped, stepping around him. She needed to get back behind the bar. She needed to be anywhere but within the gravitational pull of this man. "Excuse me, I have tables to bus." She only made it one step before his hand shot out, catching her wrist. The grip wasn't bruising, but it was absolute, an iron band wrapped in heat. "What's your name?" he asked. "Let go of me." "Your name," he repeated, his voice dropping a register, carrying a command that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Cora," she lied instantly. She used her middle name, a habit she'd picked up dealing with creeps. He looked at her, his eyes stripping away the lie instantly. But he let it slide. He released her wrist. "Go back to work, Cora, and do yourself a favor. The next time you see a stray dog backing into a corner, don't try to pet it. It usually bites." He walked away, stepping out into the neon-lit street without looking back. His men followed him like shadows. Cora practically ran back behind the bar. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped a highball glass. It shattered on the rubber mats, a sharp, violent sound. She knelt down to pick up the pieces, her breathing shallow and ragged. She had saved a stranger. No, she corrected herself, staring at her trembling hands. She had kissed a monster. And worst of all, she couldn't wash the taste of him out of her mouth. Fear is a funny thing. It doesn't always hit you in the moment. In the moment, biology takes over. Fight, flight, or freeze. The real fear comes later. It comes in the quiet hours when the adrenaline is gone, leaving your brain to calculate exactly how close you came to the edge of the cliff. For 3 days, Cora lived on that cliff edge. Every time the door to the albatross opened, her heart kicked against her ribs. Every time a man in a dark coat walked down the street behind her apartment, she quickened her pace, her keys threaded tightly between her knuckles. She spent her off hours in the glow of her laptop, typing vague descriptions into search engines, trying to put a name to the man with the slate eyes. It didn't take long. He wasn't exactly hiding. He just operated in a stratum of the city she usually only read about when bodies were pulled from the river. Dominic Rossi. He wasn't a mid-level enforcer or a street boss. He was the head of the Rossi Syndicate, the organization that controlled the docks, the unions, and half the illicit cash flow in the city. The articles described him as a businessman with alleged ties to organized crime, but the subtext was written in blood. He was ruthless, calculating, and famously elusive. He didn't make mistakes, except sitting alone in a bar, which, she now knew, hadn't been a mistake at all. By Sunday night, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the city streets into slick, black mirrors. The bar was dead. A few regulars nursed beers at the far end of the counter, but the booths were empty. Cora was polishing a row of martini glasses, trying to convince herself that the silence meant safety. He was a boss. He had bigger things to worry about than a waitress who made a fool of herself. He had probably forgotten her face the moment he walked out the door. At 11:30 p.m., the front door opened. The wind blew a flurry of raindrops onto the hardwood floor. Cora didn't look up immediately, carefully setting a glass down on the rack. But the silence in the room changed. The low murmur of the regulars abruptly stopped. The bartender at the other end of the rail froze. Cora looked up. Dominic Rossi was standing in the doorway. He was wearing a long black wool coat, his shoulders damp from the rain. 4 men flanked him. Large, quiet men whose eyes scanned the room with professional paranoia. Dominic didn't look at the room. He looked at Cora. He gave a slight jerk of his chin to his men. They stopped by the door. Dominic unbuttoned his coat and walked slowly across the floor, his heavy boots making no sound. He walked directly to the bar, pulling out a stool right in front of her station. He sat down, folding his large hands on the polished wood. Up close, in the brighter light of the bar, he looked even more intimidating. He had the kind of face carved from hard experience. Sharp angles, a prominent jaw, and a small white scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "Pour me a drink," he said. Cora stared at him. Her survival instinct screamed at her to run into the kitchen, but her pride rooted her to the spot. She grabbed a heavy rocks glass, scooped a single cube of ice into it, and poured a generous measure of the most expensive scotch on the shelf. She set it down in front of him. Her hand, miraculously, didn't shake. "You're alive," Dominic noted, picking up the glass. "So are you," Cora replied, her voice tight. "Are you here to tip me for Thursday night, or are you here to shoot up my bar?" Dominic took a slow sip of the scotch. His eyes never left her face. "Neither. I came to have a conversation." "I'm working." "No, you're not." He gestured slightly to the rest of the room. The regulars had quietly paid their tabs and were shuffling out the door. Even the other bartender had mysteriously found a reason to check the kegs in the basement. Within seconds, it was just Cora, Dominic, and the 4 statues by the door. "See?" Dominic said softly. "You're off the clock." Cora crossed her arms over her chest, trying to suppress a shiver. "What do you want, Mr. Rossi?" He didn't look surprised that she knew his name. "You did some homework. Good. It saves me the trouble of explaining who I am." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. I want to know why you did it. I told you. I was trying to save your life. People don't do that. Not in this city. Not for strangers. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bar. The smell of him, rain, cedar, and danger, drifted across the wood. A woman who works in a place like this sees trouble. She walks the other way. You didn't just step in. You physically put yourself between a gun and a target. Why? Cora looked away, staring at the bottles behind him. My brother, she said quietly. It was the truth, dragging out of her against her will. He was at a gas station 3 years ago. 2 guys got into a turf dispute. One pulled a gun. My brother was just buying cigarettes. He took a stray bullet to the neck. She looked back at Dominic, her eyes hard. He bled out on the linoleum while everyone else ran away. I watched those guys walking toward you. I saw what was going to happen. I couldn't just stand there and mop up the blood again. Dominic studied her in silence for a long time. The cynical edge in his eyes softened, just a fraction, replaced by something heavier. A noble sentiment, he finally said. But stupid. Excuse me? You didn't save a civilian, Cora. You intervened in a hit orchestrated by the Moretti family. You put your hands on me, you dragged me into a booth, and you humiliated 3 of their best enforcers in public. Cora's stomach plummeted. I didn't know. Ignorance isn't armor, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. The Morettis don't like to be embarrassed. Word is out on the street. They're looking for the girl who distracted their men. They think you're one of mine. They think you were part of the trap. Cora gripped the edge of the bar, the wood digging into her palms. I have nothing to do with you. You have to tell them that. I don't explain myself to dead men, Dominic replied simply. But we have a problem. You stepped onto a chessboard without knowing the rules. You're a liability to yourself, and, strangely enough, you're a liability to me. How am I a liability to you? Because, Dominic said, leaning closer until his face was inches from hers. In my world, if I let someone kill a woman who saved my life, even if I didn't need saving, it makes me look weak. And I cannot afford to look weak. He reached into his coat pocket. Cora flinched, but he didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a sleek, black smartphone and slid it across the bar toward her. What is this? She whispered. That is your new leash, Dominic said. You quit this job tonight. You pack a bag. There's a car waiting outside. You're coming with me. Cora stared at him, outrage finally piercing through the terror. You are insane. I am not going anywhere with a mafia boss. I'll go to the police. Dominic actually laughed. It was a dark, hollow sound. The police work for me, Cora. Or they work for the Morettis. There is no white knight coming. You walk out of here alone, you'll be dead by tomorrow morning. He stood up, towering over the bar. The casual demeanor was gone, replaced by the sheer, crushing presence of a man who ruled by fear. You forced your way into my life on Thursday. Now, I'm forcing my way into yours. Let's go. The interior of the SUV smelled like expensive leather and gun oil. It was a sensory contradiction that told Cora exactly where her life was heading. She sat pressed against the cold glass of the rear passenger window, watching the neon blur of the city wash by in the rain. Dominic sat beside her. He took up entirely too much space, though he wasn't moving. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't look out the window. He just stared at the reinforced partition separating them from the driver, his breathing a slow, measured metronome. No one had spoken since they left the alley behind the Albatross. Cora's duffel bag sat at her feet, packed with 3 pairs of jeans, some faded sweaters, and a toothbrush. It was everything she had managed to shove together while two men in tailored suits stood in her tiny hallway, their hands resting casually over their jackets. She had never felt poorer or smaller than she did in that moment. "You're suffocating yourself." The rough, gravelly voice broke the silence. Cora flinched. She looked over to see Dominic watching her. "I'm fine," she lied. Her chest was so tight she was taking shallow, thready breaths. "You haven't unclenched your jaw in 40 minutes. Your knuckles are white." He shifted slightly, the leather of the seat groaning under his weight. "We aren't driving you to a quarry, Cora. If I wanted you dead, you would have stayed at the bar." "Forgive me if I don't find comfort in your unique brand of philanthropy," she snapped. A heavy silence descended again. Dominic didn't argue. He just watched her, his slate eyes catching the passing streetlights. It was a deeply unnerving look. It wasn't predatory in the traditional sense. It was analytical, like she was a complex knot he was trying to figure out how to untie. The car left the city limits, trading cramped streets for wide, winding roads that cut through dense, rain-soaked woods. 20 minutes later, they pulled up to a massive set of wrought iron gates. They swung open silently, revealing a winding driveway that led to a sprawling stone estate. It wasn't ostentatious, but it radiated quiet, impenetrable wealth. It looked like a fortress pretending to be a home. The SUV stopped under a covered portico. The driver opened the door, and the cold, damp air rushed in. Dominic stepped out first. He didn't offer his hand. Cora scrambled out after him, clutching her cheap duffel bag against her chest like a shield. The inside of the house was aggressively silent. The floors were dark oak, the walls lined with muted, expensive art. There were no family photos. There was no clutter. It felt completely devoid of human warmth. "Matteo will show you to your room," Dominic said, shrugging off his wet coat. A broad-shouldered man with a severely broken nose stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. "Do not leave the house. Do not go near the windows on the east wing. Do not use your cell phone. The signal is jammed anyway, but if you try to connect to the Wi-Fi, I will know, and I will take the phone." Cora stared at him, the reality of her captivity finally sinking its teeth in. "So I'm a prisoner. You are a guest with very strict boundaries," Dominic corrected smoothly. "The Morettis have eyes everywhere. They are currently looking for a brunette waitress who likes to throw herself into crossfire. Until I neutralize the threat, you stay here, where I can see you." He turned to walk away. "Wait," Cora called out. Her voice shook, but she refused to let it break. Dominic paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "How long?" she asked. "How long does it take to neutralize an entire mafia family?" His expression didn't change, but his eyes went dead flat. "As long as it takes to find the man who signed the order and put a bullet in his eye. Good night, Cora." He disappeared down a long corridor. Matteo cleared his throat, gesturing to the sweeping staircase. Cora followed him up, her legs feeling like lead. He led her to a guest room at the end of the hall. It was massive, decorated in shades of charcoal and cream, with a bed large enough to sleep 4 people. Matteo opened the door and stepped back. "Breakfast is at 8. Don't wander," he said gruffly. Cora walked in and dropped her bag on the floor. She turned back to Matteo. "Does the door lock?" Matteo looked at her, a strange, pitying expression crossing his scarred face. He reached out and tapped the heavy brass mechanism on the door handle. "The lock is on the inside, miss," he said quietly. "Mr. Rossi gave strict orders. You lock us out. We don't lock you in." He pulled the door shut. The heavy click of the latch echoed in the vast room. Cora walked over to the door, turned the deadbolt, and finally, for the first time in 3 days, collapsed onto the floor, and let herself cry. Morning didn't bring clarity. It just brought better lighting to her nightmare. Cora woke up fully dressed on top of the duvet. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy grey overcast that filtered through the large windows. She stood up, her joints aching from the tension, and walked into the attached bathroom. She splashed cold water on her face, staring at her reflection. She looked pale, hunted. She needed coffee. More importantly, she needed to understand the layout of her cage. She unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The silence of the house was oppressive. She walked softly, finding her way down the grand staircase and following the smell of roasted beans into a massive, industrial-grade kitchen. An older woman was standing at the stove, frying eggs. She wore a neat apron and had iron-grey hair pulled into a tight bun. "You must be the stray," the woman said, without turning around. Her voice was sharp, but not unkind. "Sit. Coffee is in the pot. Mugs are to your left." Cora hesitated, then moved to pour herself a cup. "I'm Cora. I'm Mrs. Gable. I run the house. And before you ask, no, I don't know anything about Mr. Rossi's business, and if I did, I wouldn't tell you. How do you like your eggs?" "I'm not hungry, thank you." Mrs. Gable finally turned, eyeing Cora with a critical squint. "You look like you're going to blow away in a stiff breeze. Eat the eggs. In this house, you take the fuel when you can get it." Cora took the plate, sitting at the edge of the large marble island. "Is he awake?" "Mr. Rossi has been awake since 4. He's in his office, down the hall, last door on the right. But I wouldn't bother him. He's running a war from a desk today." Cora picked at her food. The normalcy of the kitchen felt grotesque compared to the reality of the situation. Running a war. She finished her coffee, left the plate half-eaten, and walked down the hallway Mrs. Gable had pointed out. She didn't know what she was going to say. She just knew she couldn't sit in a room and wait to be told she was allowed to live. The door to the office was slightly ajar. Cora pushed it open. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, smelling of old paper and leather. Dominic sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He wasn't wearing a jacket today, just a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a network of faded ink and scars. He was staring at a laptop, a phone pressed to his ear. He didn't look up when she entered, but he held up a single finger, silencing her before she could speak. "I don't care what the Port Authority says," Dominic said into the phone. His voice was dangerously calm, devoid of the gravelly warmth it had when he spoke to her. "The shipment moves tonight. If the inspector asks questions, you pay him. If he won't take the money, you break his legs and talk to his supervisor. Make it happen." He hung up the phone and tossed it onto the desk. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. He looked exactly like the man she had seen sitting in the back booth of the Albatross, utterly bone-deep exhausted. Then he dropped his hand, and his eyes locked onto her. The mask was back, cold slate. "You're wandering," he said. "I'm going crazy," Cora replied, stepping further into the room. "I need to know what the plan is. I can't just sit here indefinitely." "The plan is you stay alive. It's a very simple plan. I suggest you stick to it." "And what about my life?" Cora demanded, her frustration boiling over. "My job, my apartment. The rent is due next week. I have a life out there, Dominic." It was the first time she had used his first name. It hung in the air between them, heavy and intimate. Dominic stood up slowly. He walked around the desk, his movements deliberate, predatory. Cora held her ground, refusing to step back as he closed the distance until he was standing mere inches from her. "Your life out there is paused," he said, looking down at her. Because you decided to play hero. Do you understand what the Morettis do to people they think are my assets? They don't just kill them, Cora. They make an example of them. They would find you in your apartment. They would spend 3 days tearing you apart, and then they would mail the pieces to my front gate. Cora swallowed hard, her pulse jumping in her throat. The heat radiating off his body was distracting. So what? I'm just your property now? Dominic reached out. Cora stiffened, expecting a strike or a harsh grip. Instead, his knuckles grazed her cheek, surprisingly gentle, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You are my responsibility," he said softly. His gaze dropped to her mouth, lingering there for a beat too long before rising to meet her eyes. "You put your hands on me. You claimed me in front of half the underworld. In their eyes, you are mine, which means I protect you." "I only kissed you to save your life," she whispered, her voice betraying her by shaking. "I know," Dominic murmured, leaning in just a fraction. The smell of cedar and black coffee washed over her. "And it's the only reason you're breathing right now. But don't mistake my protection for patience. Learn the walls of your cage, Cora. It will make the time pass much easier." He stepped back, breaking the spell, and walked past her toward the door. "Go read a book. I have a city to dismantle." By day 4, the gilded cage started to feel like a pressure cooker. Cora hadn't seen the sun. The rain returned, a relentless downpour that mirrored the oppressive mood inside the estate. The house was heavily guarded. Men in dark suits moved silently through the halls, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The outside world was entirely cut off, but the tension bleeding into the house told Cora that a war was raging just beyond the iron gates. Dominic was a ghost. He was either locked in his office or gone completely, disappearing in armored convoys before dawn and returning late at night. It was 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. Cora was sitting in the massive, unused library, pretending to read a thick volume on Renaissance art while actually listening to the storm outside. The heavy oak doors of the library slammed open. Cora jumped, dropping the book. Matteo stood in the doorway, his face grim. Blood smeared his collar. "Stay here," Matteo barked at her. "Lock the doors." Before she could ask a single question, he turned and jogged down the hall. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She didn't lock the doors. She followed him. She crept down the corridor, the thick Persian rugs muffling her footsteps. She heard voices coming from the main foyer, harsh, jagged voices. She stopped at the edge of the hallway, peering around the corner. Dominic was standing in the center of the marble foyer. His suit jacket was off, his white shirt stained with something dark and rust-colored. 2 of his men were holding a third man on his knees. Cora recognized the man on his knees. It was Leo, the lead thug from the bar, the one who had pulled the gun. His face was a swollen, purple mess. One of his eyes was swollen shut. He was coughing, spitting a mixture of blood and saliva onto the immaculate floor. "I told you," Leo wheezed, looking up at Dominic with a mixture of defiance and terror. "I don't know where the old man is. He moves every night. He knew you'd come for us after the bar." Dominic stood over him, holding a heavy crystal tumbler of whiskey. He looked utterly unbothered by the violence. He looked bored. "Leo," Dominic said, taking a slow sip. "You and I both know that's a lie. You're a capo. You sign the checks. You know where Moretti sleeps. I'm going to ask you one last time, and if you lie to me again, I'm going to have Matteo introduce your hands to a blowtorch." Cora clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle a gasp. Her stomach rolled. She had known intellectually what Dominic was. She had read the articles. But reading about a monster was very different from watching him work. Leo laughed, a wet, rattling sound. Screw you, Rossi. You think you're untouchable? The boss already put a price on your head, and that little piece of trash you were kissing at the bar. We know she's a nobody. We checked her out. Cora, waitress, has a dead brother. The boss sent a crew to her apartment an hour ago. She's probably a stain on the floorboards by now. A profound, terrifying silence dropped over the foyer. Cora stopped breathing. Her apartment. If she hadn't been forced into the SUV. Dominic didn't yell. He didn't throw his glass. His face went entirely blank, a terrifying absolute zero. He carefully set the whiskey glass down on a side table. He stepped forward, grabbed Leo by the hair, and yanked his head back. "You sent men to her house?" Dominic asked. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a smooth, lethal calm. "Yeah," Leo spat. "She's dead, Rossi. You failed to protect her." "Matteo," Dominic said without looking away from Leo's remaining good eye. "Boss? Call the cleanup crew for 4th Street. Tell them to sweep the apartment. If there are Moretti men there, kill them. If they are already gone, burn the building down to erase the scent." "Done," Matteo said, stepping back to use his radio. Dominic looked back down at Leo. "You made 2 mistakes tonight, Leo. First, you assumed you could touch what belongs to me. Second, you assumed she was there." Dominic let go of Leo's hair. He turned his back, walking toward the table to retrieve his whiskey. "Kill him. Take him to the incinerator at the docks." "Wait!" Leo screamed, the bravado shattering instantly as the 2 guards hauled him to his feet. "Wait, I'll tell you. He's at the warehouse in the Navy Yard. Rossi, wait." "I already knew that," Dominic said quietly. He didn't turn around. He just flicked his wrist. One of the guards drew a suppressed pistol and shot Leo in the back of the head. Pfft. It wasn't a loud bang. It was a mechanical cough. Leo dropped to the floor like a sack of cement. Cora violently recoiled, backing away from the corner. Her heel caught the edge of a side table. A small decorative vase wobbled and crashed to the floor, shattering loudly in the deadly quiet of the hall. The 2 guards instantly raised their weapons, pivoting toward the sound. "Stand down!" Dominic roared, his voice finally breaking its calm, shattering the air like thunder. He strode around the corner, his eyes wild, locking onto Cora. She was pressed flat against the wall, trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at the blood on his shirt, then at his hands, then at his face. The reality of his world had just smashed into hers, brutal and undeniable. Dominic stopped 3 feet away from her. The anger drained from his face, replaced by a dark, heavy realization. He saw exactly what she was seeing. "Cora," he said softly, taking a half step forward, his hand reaching out. "Don't," she choked out, shrinking away from him. "Don't touch me." She had kissed a man to save his life. But standing in the hallway, looking at the cold-blooded executioner in front of her, she finally realized the truth. The man in the bar had never needed saving. She did. There was no sound left in the world. The mechanical puff of the suppressed gunshot had somehow vacuumed all the oxygen out of the hallway. Cora stared at Dominic's outstretched hand. It was a large, calloused hand. A hand that poured scotch, signed shipping manifests, and ordered executions with a flick of the wrist. She looked from his hand to his eyes. The slate-grey irises were completely stripped of the cold, aristocratic boredom he usually wore. He looked horrified, not by what he had done, but by the fact that she was looking at him. "Matteo," Dominic said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look away from Cora. "Get it out of here. Bleach the floor." "Yes, boss." The sound of fabric dragging against marble was wet and heavy. Cora couldn't breathe. Her lungs forgot how to expand. The walls of the corridor seemed to be tilting inward, the heavy Persian rugs undulating beneath her feet. She backed away, her spine hitting the cool plaster of the wall, and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Dominic took a step forward, then stopped. He understood the geometry of fear better than anyone. He knew that closing the distance would only make the animal panic worse. Instead, he slowly took off his suit jacket, tossing it onto a nearby chair, and then unbuttoned his cuffs. He sat down on the floor across from her, 3 feet away, close enough to anchor her, far enough to let her breathe. "Look at the baseboard," Dominic said. His voice was a low, steady rumble. Cora shook her head violently, her breath coming in ragged, high-pitched gasps. "Cora, don't look at me. Look at the baseboard." The absolute authority in his tone cut through the rising static of her panic attack. "Count the grooves in the wood. Breathe in for 4 seconds. Hold it for 4. Breathe out for 4. She dragged her eyes away from his blood-stained shirt and stared at the dark oak trim near the floor. She counted. She inhaled. The air tasted like copper and rain, but it finally filled her lungs. They sat in silence on the floor for 10 minutes. The only sound was the distant murmur of men moving quickly through the house, cleaning up the violence, resetting the board. "He's dead," Cora finally whispered to the baseboard. "Yes." "You didn't even hesitate." "If I hesitate, the people I protect die," Dominic replied. There was no apology in his voice, only a bleak, immovable truth. "Leo was a dead man the second he walked into my bar. He knew it. I knew it. The only thing we were negotiating tonight was the location of his boss." Cora lifted her head, looking at him. He looked exhausted. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tight, the shadows under his eyes looking like bruises in the dim light of the hall. "You burned my apartment," she said. The reality of it was finally sinking in. Dominic's jaw flexed. "I ordered it burned if the Morettis had already found it, and based on what Leo said, they had. Everything I own was in there." Her voice cracked, a sudden sharp ache blooming in her chest, replacing the terror. "My clothes, my books." She squeezed her eyes shut. "The shoebox under my bed. It had the only physical photos I had left of my brother. It had his watch." Dominic didn't say anything. He just watched a tear slip down her cheek, tracking through the pale dust on her skin. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I can buy you 1,000 apartments," he said quietly. "I can fill them with whatever you want. But I can't buy you a new life if you're dead. The Morettis went to your home to torture you to death. They went there to cut you to pieces just to see if I would flinch. Burning the apartment erases your ghost. It tells them they were too late." "I am a ghost," Cora said, a bitter laugh escaping her throat. "I don't exist anymore. Cora the waitress died the second she walked over to your booth." "She did," Dominic agreed. He didn't offer false comfort. "That girl is gone. The question is, who are you now?" Cora looked at him, searching for the monster she had seen 5 minutes ago. He was still there, lurking just beneath the skin, but he wasn't looking at her like prey. He was looking at her like an equal who had just survived a shipwreck. Dominic stood up, offering his hand again. This time, he didn't pull it back. "We are leaving," he said. Cora stared at his hand. "Where?" "The Navy Yard," Dominic said, his eyes going flat and hard. "Leo gave up the location. The war ends tonight. And since it is painfully obvious that there is a leak in my organization who told the Morettis about your apartment, I am not leaving you behind in this house." He waited. He didn't force her. It was the first real choice she had been given since she stepped in front of a gun. She could stay in the house, surrounded by men who might be traitors, waiting for the violence to find her. Or she could go with the devil who had burned her life to the ground to keep her breathing. Cora reached out and put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm, calloused, and unbreakable. He pulled her to her feet. "Go put on shoes you can run in," Dominic said. The convoy consisted of 2 matte black SUVs. There were no headlights. They drove through the industrial outskirts of the city, using night vision optics, slipping through the rain like shadows. Cora sat in the back of the second vehicle. Dominic was beside her, a heavy tactical vest strapped over his black shirt. He held an assault rifle resting casually across his knees. He looked entirely in his element. The civilized businessman in the tailored suit was gone. This was the warlord. "The warehouse is at the end of Pier 44, Dominic said, into a radio clipped to his shoulder. "Matteo, your team takes the rear loading docks. We take the front. No survivors. If you see Moretti, blow his kneecaps out. I want him alive for a conversation." "Copy that, boss." Matteo's voice crackled through the earpiece. Cora tightened her seatbelt. Her heart was beating so fast, it felt like a continuous, painful vibration in her chest. She was wearing her faded jeans, a heavy black sweater Dominic had tossed her, and a pair of sturdy boots. She felt ridiculous, a civilian dragged into a war zone. "Keep your head down," Dominic said, glancing at her. "When we stop, you stay in the car. The glass is rated for armor-piercing rounds. The doors lock from the inside. Do not open them for anyone except me or Matteo. Understood?" "Yes," she whispered. The SUVs turned onto the access road leading to the docks. The rain was coming down in sideways sheets, turning the world into a grey, featureless blur. Shipping containers loomed on either side of the road like rusted steel canyons. Suddenly, the lead SUV slammed on its brakes, the heavy vehicle fishtailing on the wet asphalt. "Ambush!" the radio screamed. The world exploded. A deafening roar ripped through the night as a heavy machine gun opened fire from the top of a shipping container. The rounds hammered into the hood of the lead SUV, sparking wildly against the armor plating. "Down!" Dominic roared, grabbing Cora by the back of the neck and shoving her face first into the leather seat. He threw his own body over hers just as the side of their SUV took a barrage of fire. The reinforced glass spider-webbed instantly, glowing white under the impact of the bullets. But it held. The noise was apocalyptic. It sounded like they were inside a metal drum being beaten with sledgehammers. "Reverse! Get us out of the kill zone!" Dominic shouted at the driver. The driver slammed the car into reverse, the tires screaming against the wet pavement. But the trap was already sprung. A heavy flatbed truck pulled out from an alleyway behind them, blocking the retreat. They were boxed in. "They knew we were coming," Dominic snarled, checking the action on his rifle. "The leak is higher up than I thought." He looked down at Cora. She was pressed into the seat, her hands covering her ears, her eyes squeezed shut in absolute terror. "Cora, look at me," he commanded. She opened her eyes. His face was inches from hers, calm and terrifyingly focused. "The armor on this car won't hold forever," he said rapidly. "When I open this door, I'm going to provide cover fire. You are going to get out, stay low, and run to the gap between those 2 red shipping containers. Do you see them?" She looked past his shoulder, through the fractured, milky glass. About 30 feet away, there was a narrow alley between 2 towering steel boxes. "I can't," she sobbed. "I can't run out there." "You can, and you will," Dominic said. His hand gripped her jaw, forcing her to focus entirely on him. "I didn't burn your life down just to let you die in a parking lot. When I say move, you move." He turned to the driver. "Pop the locks. On 3. Dominic shifted his weight, pressing his back against the door, his rifle raised. 1, 2, 3. The door kicked open. The noise of the gunfire doubled in volume, a deafening mechanical roar. Dominic leaned out, firing in short, controlled bursts toward the top of the containers. "Go!" he screamed. Cora scrambled over the seat. Her boots hit the wet asphalt. She didn't look left or right. She kept her head down and ran. The 30 feet felt like 30 miles. She could hear the distinct, terrifying zip of bullets cutting through the air around her, the wet thwack of rounds hitting the pavement at her feet. She threw herself into the narrow gap between the red containers, sliding on the slick concrete, scraping her knees through her jeans. She spun around, gasping for air, peering back into the rain. Dominic was still by the car, holding the line. His men were out of the lead SUV, returning fire, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Sparks rained down from the catwalks above as the Moretti men poured fire into the trap. Then Cora saw it. A man stepped out from behind a concrete pylon, flanking Dominic's position. He raised a shotgun, aiming directly at Dominic's exposed side. "Dominic!" Cora screamed. It ripped from her throat, raw and desperate. Dominic heard her. He pivoted, bringing his rifle around, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The shotgun roared. Dominic jerked backward, the heavy impact throwing him against the side of the SUV. He didn't drop his rifle. He fired one-handed, dropping the man with the shotgun, but then Dominic's knees buckled. He slid down the side of the car, gripping his left shoulder. Panic, hot and blinding, flared in Cora's chest. The man who was supposed to be untouchable was bleeding on the ground. She didn't think. Just like in the bar, the instinct to intervene overrode her instinct to survive. She broke cover. She ran back out into the open fire zone, sprinting toward the SUV. "Get back!" Dominic shouted, his voice strained with pain, trying to wave her away. Cora ignored him. She slid onto her knees beside him, grabbing the heavy strap of his tactical vest. "Get up!" she screamed, hauling on the fabric with all her strength. "You get up right now!" Dominic gritted his teeth, his slate eyes wide with shock at her sheer stupidity. Using her leverage, he forced himself to his feet. Together, stumbling, they made a desperate, chaotic run back toward the red shipping containers. They threw themselves into the gap, just as a hail of bullets shredded the side of the SUV where they had been standing a second before. They collapsed against the rusted steel wall, panting, soaked in rain and adrenaline. Dominic leaned his head back against the metal, breathing heavily. He looked down at his left shoulder. The tactical vest had caught the brunt of the buckshot, but a piece of shrapnel or a stray pellet had punched through the gap near his collarbone. Blood was seeping rapidly into his black shirt. He looked at Cora. She was shaking, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide with shock. "I told you," Dominic panted, a dark, blood-stained smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Never to pet a stray dog when it's backed into a corner." "Shut up," she cried, tearing the hem of her sweater. "Just shut up and let me stop the bleeding." The gap between the containers led to a maintenance access tunnel beneath Pier 44. It was dark, smelling of stagnant salt water and decaying concrete. The gunfire above had faded into a distant, sporadic popping. Matteo and the surviving men had broken the ambush, pushing the Moretti crew back, but Dominic was in no condition to lead an assault on the main warehouse. They sat on a raised concrete walkway in the gloom. Dominic had shrugged off the heavy tactical vest. Cora was kneeling between his legs, pressing a thick wad of torn fabric against the wound just beneath his collarbone. "Press harder," Dominic instructed quietly. "I'm going to hurt you," Cora whispered, her hands slick with his blood. "It already hurts. Push." She leaned her weight into her hands. Dominic didn't flinch, but she felt the muscles in his chest and stomach locked tight as steel under her touch. The proximity was staggering. Stripped of his suits, his armor, and his army, he was just a man bleeding in the dark. But the gravitational pull of him was stronger than ever. "Why did you come back out there?" he asked, his voice low, vibrating in the narrow space between them. "I don't know," she admitted. A tear slipped free, mingling with the rain on her cheek. "I guess I make a habit of trying to save men who don't deserve it." Dominic reached up with his good hand. His knuckles were bruised, stained with grime and gunpowder. He gently wiped the tear from her face. His thumb lingered on her jawline. "I don't deserve it," he agreed softly. "I dragged you into hell. I burned your life down. I let you see things that will give you nightmares for the rest of your life." "You did," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs, but not from fear. Not anymore. "When this is over," Dominic said, his eyes locking onto hers, stripping away every defense, every lie. "I will give you a new name. I will put $1 million in a bank account in Switzerland. You can go anywhere in the world. You will never have to see me or this city ever again." Cora stared at him. It was everything she should have wanted. It was freedom. It was safety. But looking into his eyes, she realized something terrifying. The gilded cage hadn't just been keeping the monsters out. It had been locking her in with the only man who truly saw her. The man who hadn't babied her when she panicked. The man who had demanded she find her courage under fire. She thought about her old life, pouring cheap gin for men who didn't respect her, coming home to an empty, cold apartment, living like a ghost long before the fire erased her. She slowly lowered her hands from his wound. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish crawl. She looked at the blood on her palms, and then back up to his face. "I don't want a new name," she whispered. Dominic went completely still. His chest stopped rising. The air in the tunnel grew incredibly heavy. "Cora," he warned, a harsh, jagged edge to his voice. "Do not play games with me. Not now. If you stay, there is no walking away. You belong to this world. You belong to me. It is violent, it is ugly, and it will consume you." "I know," she said, her voice steadying, finding a dark, solid anchor in the chaos. "I know exactly what you are." She leaned in, closing the final few inches between them. This kiss wasn't a collision. It wasn't a distraction to save a life. It was a surrender and a conquest all at once. Her lips met his, tasting rain, copper, and salt. Dominic let out a low groan, his good arm wrapping around her waist, hauling her flush against his chest. He kissed her with the desperate, bruising intensity of a man who had spent his entire life in the cold and had finally found a fire. He didn't treat her like she was fragile. He kissed her like she was the only real thing left in a world made of ghosts and gunpowder. Footsteps echoed at the far end of the tunnel. Dominic broke the kiss, his breathing ragged, his forehead resting against hers. He kept his arm tightly around her waist. Matteo stepped out of the shadows, a heavy flashlight cutting through the gloom. He was covered in soot, but he looked unharmed. "Boss," Matteo called out, lowering the light respectfully. "The ambush is broken. We pushed through to the warehouse. Moretti was there. He tried to run." "And?" Dominic asked, his voice returning to that cold, gravelly authority, though his hand remained tangled in Cora's shirt. "He won't be running anymore," Matteo said grimly. "The family is done. The city is yours." Dominic nodded slowly. He looked down at Cora. She looked back, her chin held high, the fear entirely burned out of her eyes, replaced by a fierce, undeniable resolve. She had walked through the fire, and she was still standing. "Matteo," Dominic said, pulling Cora up as he forced himself to stand. "Yes, boss?" "Call the doctor. Tell him to meet us at the estate." Dominic looked at Cora, a slow, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "We're going home." Cora stepped in front of a bullet to save a stranger, only to realize that the stranger was a monster who ruled the underworld. But in the ashes of her old life, she found something she never expected, a man willing to burn the city to the ground to keep her safe. She didn't just survive the Mafia boss, she conquered him. What did you think of Cora's final choice? Would you have taken the money and run, or stayed in the dark with Dominic? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this deep, gritty Mafia romance, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another story.